Have you ever felt watched in the forest, completely alone? For Ethan Carter, an ordinary lumberjack, this feeling became reality when a black wolf emerged from the shadows after his terrible accident. Today I'll tell you how this creature wasn't just a simple animal, but an ancient guardian that would forever change the fate of one man and an entire community. Discover the secret world of the forest guardians and how they might be closer than we imagine. Subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Shall we begin this journey? The gray light of pre-dawn seeped through the worn curtains of Ethan Carter's cabin as he sat at his rough-hewn kitchen table, calloused hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. At 53, Ethan's face was a weathered map of deep lines and scars, testament to decades of working in the unforgiving wilderness of the Appalachian foothills. His once dark hair was now more salt than pepper, cropped short and practical, while his beard was kept trimmed but full. Only his eyes remained unchanged, alert and forest green, observing the world with the patience of a man who had learned to move at nature's pace. The cabin itself was modest but solid, built by Ethan's own hands 15 years ago after returning to his hometown of Blackridge. The small mountain community nestled in the shadows of ancient forests had barely changed in the 30 years he'd been away. Unlike Ethan himself, who had left as a young man full of restless energy and returned quieter, more deliberate, carrying burdens invisible to the eye. A gentle knock at the door interrupted his morning ritual. Ethan glanced at the old pendulum clock on the wall, 5:43 a.m. Few people in Blackridge rose this early. "Coming," he called, his voice gravelly from disuse. He opened the door to find Pastor Samuel Winters standing on his porch, a man nearly as old as the church he had served for over 4 decades. The pastor's thin frame was wrapped in a heavy coat, his breath visible in the crisp mountain air. "Morning, Ethan. Hope I'm not disturbing you too early," the pastor said, his voice carrying the soft lilt of Appalachian cadence. "No earlier than I'm already disturbed," Ethan replied with a slight smile. "Come in, Pastor. Coffee's hot." Inside, Pastor Samuel removed his worn cap, revealing thin white hair carefully combed over. His face was lean and kindly, with crow's feet speaking of a lifetime of gentle smiles. He accepted the offered mug with grateful hands. "I'll get right to it, Ethan. The church needs your help," he said after a warming sip. "That old oak altar has finally given up. Dry rot's gotten to it bad." Ethan nodded, unsurprised. "That altar was old when we were boys throwing spitballs in Sunday school." "Indeed it was," the pastor chuckled. "We need something special to replace it. Not just any lumber will do." His expression grew more serious. "I was thinking about one of those red oaks from the North Ridge. They've got the right presence. I know it's asking a lot." Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. The North Ridge of Blackridge Forest was remote, a good 4-hour hike into wilderness that grew increasingly untamed. Few locals ventured there anymore. "Could go to Johnson's Mill down in Grayson," Ethan suggested. "They've got good oak." Pastor Samuel shook his head. "This isn't just about wood, Ethan. That church has stood through wars, depressions, and floods. People need something rooted in this land. Something with meaning." A weighted silence filled the cabin as Ethan considered. The request wasn't merely about lumber. It was about heritage, continuity, the things that kept small communities like Blackridge alive. "The North Ridge Trail hasn't been maintained in years," Ethan finally said. "And there's that matter with the Park Service about protected areas." The pastor's eyes didn't waver. "I've spoken with Ranger Mackenzie. There's a section just outside the protected boundary. Old growth, but legal to harvest with the right permits." He reached into his coat and produced an official-looking paper. "Already got it cleared." Ethan took the permit, studying it carefully before setting it on the table. He sighed deeply, feeling the familiar tug of responsibility to this community that had welcomed him back without questions. "I'll head out today. Should make it there by mid-afternoon if I leave within the hour." Relief washed over the pastor's weathered face. "God bless you, Ethan. This means more than you know." As the pastor left, Ethan began gathering his equipment: axe, saw, ropes, and provisions. Something about the task ahead stirred an uneasiness in his gut that he couldn't quite name. 25 years as a lumberjack had taught him to respect such feelings. Nevertheless, as the first rays of sunlight began to pierce the tree line, Ethan Carter shouldered his pack and set out toward the ancient heart of Blackridge Forest. unaware that this familiar journey would forever alter the course of his life. Retry continue edit chapter 2. The encounter with the healer. The morning mist clung to the forest floor as Ethan made his way along the overgrown trail. The familiar weight of his pack and the rhythmic crunch of leaves beneath his boots brought a comfortable cadence to his journey. Though the path to the North Ridge was seldom traveled these days, Ethan navigated it with the confidence of a man returning to an old friend. By mid-morning, the trail narrowed and veered east, leading him past a small clearing where a cabin stood partially hidden by towering pines. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, carrying the distinct aroma of burning sage. This was Martha Holloway's place, set apart from the town both by distance and by choice. Martha had arrived in Blackridge nearly 20 years ago, a widow in her 40s who purchased this remote plot with cash and built her cabin without help. The locals had initially viewed her with suspicion, but her knowledge of medicinal plants and her willingness to treat ailments when the nearest doctor was 2 towns over had eventually earned her a grudging respect. Ethan hadn't planned to stop, but as he passed, the cabin door swung open. Martha stood in the doorway as if she'd been expecting him. At nearly 70, she stood straight-backed and tall, her silver hair bound in a tight braid that reached her waist. Her face, though lined with age, held a sharpness in her hazel eyes that seemed to look through rather than at people. "Ethan Carter," she called, her voice stronger than her frame suggested. "You're headed deep today." Ethan paused, adjusting his pack. "Morning, Martha. Just passing through." "No one just passes through to the North Ridge," she replied, stepping onto her porch. She wore a simple flannel shirt and jeans, with a leather pouch hanging from her belt. "Come have some tea before you go further. The ridge isn't going anywhere." Something in her tone made it sound less like an invitation and more like a necessity. Ethan hesitated, but found himself walking toward her cabin anyway. Inside, the single room was warm and filled with the scents of dried herbs that hung in bunches from the ceiling beams. Shelves lined the walls, holding jars of roots, leaves, and powders labeled in neat handwriting. A table covered with open books and small carved wooden animals occupied the center of the room. Martha gestured to a chair while she poured steaming liquid from a kettle into 2 tin cups. "Red oak tea," she said, placing a cup before him. "Good for strength. You'll need it today." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "How do you know what I'm after?" Martha's lips curled into a subtle smile. "Small town. Word travels. Samuel's not exactly subtle when he wants something." The tea was bitter but warming. Ethan sipped it carefully, watching Martha over the rim of his cup. "That section of the ridge," she said without preamble. "It remembers things the rest of the forest has forgotten." "It's just trees, Martha." "Is it?" Her eyes locked with his. "Those old oaks have been growing there since before white men set foot in these mountains." The Cherokee considered that grove sacred. They believed it was where the forest spoke to those who knew how to listen. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "I respect the land, but I've been cutting trees for over 25 years. Never heard one speak yet." Martha leaned forward, her voice dropping. "The forest has been restless lately. I felt it. So have the animals." She gestured to a row of small pouches hanging by her door. "People from town have been coming more often for protection charms. They don't call them that. Of course, they're too proud. But that's what they're asking for." "Protection from what?" Ethan asked, despite himself. "Change," she said simply. "Something's shifting in the old places. The balance is." She trailed off, then reached below the table and produced a small leather pouch similar to the one at her belt. "Take this with you." Ethan made no move to accept it. "I don't believe in charms, Martha." "I don't recall asking what you believe in," she replied evenly. "The pouch contains bearberry and cedar, helps keep your wits about you. Nothing mysterious about that." Their eyes held for a long moment before Ethan reluctantly took the pouch and tucked it into his jacket. "The ridge spirits protect their own," Martha said as she walked him to the door. "Remember that when you're standing before those ancient trees. Ask permission before you take. And listen, really listen, to the answer." At the threshold, she placed a weathered hand on his arm. "The oldest red oak stands apart from the others. It's bigger, with a trunk that splits near the base. Don't touch that one, Ethan, no matter what Samuel wants. That tree isn't meant to fall." "How do you know which tree I'll find?" Ethan asked, a chill running down his spine despite the morning's growing warmth. Martha's expression softened, something like pity crossing her features. Because it will call to you. They always do. She stepped back inside. Be careful, Ethan Carter. The forest remembers those who respect it, and those who don't. As Ethan continued his journey, the leather pouch seemed to grow heavier in his pocket. He told himself it was nonsense, the superstitious ramblings of a solitary old woman. Yet as the forest deepened around him and the light changed, filtering green and gold through the ancient canopy, Martha's warnings echoed in his mind, merging with his own growing sense that something waited for him on the North Ridge. Retry O Continue Edit Chapter 3. The arrival at the forest and the accident. By early afternoon, Ethan reached the North Ridge of Blackridge Forest. The air grew noticeably cooler beneath the dense canopy of centuries-old trees that blocked much of the sunlight. Here, the forest floor was surprisingly clear of undergrowth, carpeted instead with thick moss and scattered ferns that thrived in the dim light. The silence was profound, deeper than mere quiet. It was the hushed reverence of a cathedral. Ethan paused to catch his breath, drinking from his canteen while surveying the grove. Red oaks towered around him, their massive trunks wider than a man could embrace, their uppermost branches lost in a ceiling of green far above. Some of these trees had likely been saplings when the Constitution was signed. All right, Samuel, Ethan muttered to himself. Let's find your special altar wood. He moved slowly through the grove, assessing each tree with the practiced eye of a woodsman. Too young, too knotted, too close to others. He needed one mature enough to provide the necessary lumber, but not so ancient that cutting it would feel like sacrilege. Despite himself, Martha's words about asking permission echoed in his mind. After nearly an hour of careful consideration, Ethan found it. A magnificent red oak standing slightly apart from its neighbors. Its trunk rose straight and true for nearly 40 feet before branching out into a symmetrical crown. It was old but not ancient, perhaps 200 years of growth. And then he saw it, the split-trunk oak Martha had described, standing a mere 30 yards beyond his chosen tree. It was unquestionably larger, more impressive, its base dividing into two massive trunks that rejoined higher up, creating a natural archway large enough to walk through. Ethan felt an inexplicable pull toward it, a sensation almost like recognition. He forced himself to turn away, focusing instead on the task at hand. Removing his pack, he took out his felling equipment, axe, saw, wedges, and ropes. With methodical precision, he began clearing the area around his chosen oak, ensuring a safe falling zone. Nothing personal, Ethan said quietly as he placed his hand against the rough bark. Church needs an altar. You'll serve that purpose well. He began by making the undercut on the side facing the direction he wanted the tree to fall. The steel blade of his axe bit deep into the living wood, sending chips flying. The familiar routine of the work, the swing of the axe, the solid thunk as it struck true, the rhythm of his breathing, gradually pushed away his earlier unease. After completing the undercut, Ethan took up his saw for the back cut. The teeth tore through the wood with each pull, creating a growing horizontal line that would eventually meet the angled undercut. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool air. As the back cut deepened, the first warning creaks emerged from the straining wood. Ethan paused, wiping his brow with his sleeve. He was nearly there. A few more passes with the saw, and gravity would do the rest. He inserted a wedge to prevent the weight of the tree from closing the cut and binding his saw. The instant he drove the wedge home, something changed. The breeze that had been gently rustling the canopy suddenly died, leaving an eerie stillness. In that moment of perfect quiet, Ethan could swear he heard a deep, mournful sound emanating from somewhere deep in the forest, almost like a drawn-out sigh that ended in a rumbling growl. Just the wind, he told himself, though there was no wind. With renewed determination, he returned to his saw, making the final cuts. The tree began to lean, its massive weight shifting inexorably toward the predetermined falling path. Ethan stepped back, calling out the traditional warning. Timber. It happened in a split second. As the tree began its descent, a violent gust of wind, coming from nowhere, struck the canopy. The falling trajectory altered just enough that when the tree crashed down, one of its massive limbs swung toward Ethan instead of away from him. He lunged backward, but not quickly enough. The branch caught him across the lower legs, driving him to the ground and pinning him beneath its crushing weight. Pain exploded through his left leg as he fell, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs. When he could breathe again, Ethan tried to push himself up only to discover he was firmly trapped. The limb lay diagonally across both legs, heaviest on his left. A nauseating bolt of agony shot through him when he tried to pull free. "Damn it," he gasped, falling back onto his elbows. With trembling hands, he carefully felt along his pinned leg. Nothing seemed to be protruding through his jeans, but the hot, swelling pain suggested at minimum a severe fracture. His right leg might only be bruised, but it was trapped nonetheless. Ethan looked at his pack lying just beyond arm's reach, containing his water, food, and most importantly, his emergency radio. 25 years of working in forests, and he'd never had an accident this serious. "Help!" he shouted, his voice bouncing off the trees before being swallowed by their vastness. "Anyone out here?" Only silence answered. He knew the futility of it. The nearest humans were hours away, with Martha's cabin being the closest structure. He'd told no one exactly which section of the ridge he was heading to. As the initial shock began to wear off, a cold realization settled in. Night would fall in a few hours. Temperatures in these mountains dropped rapidly after sunset, especially in early spring. Without shelter, water, or the ability to move, his situation was dire. The pain in his leg throbbed in time with his heartbeat as Ethan assessed his options. He tried again to free himself, pushing against the massive limb with all his strength, but succeeded only in intensifying the agony in his broken leg. As the afternoon light began to slant through the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor, Ethan Carter, for the first time in decades, felt genuine fear take root in his chest. In the deepening silence, he could almost hear Martha Holloway's warning. The forest remembers those who respect it, and those who don't. A lone raven cawed overhead, its harsh cry echoing through the ancient grove like an omen. Retry continue edit chapter 4. The night of despair and the emergence of the guardian dusk descended upon the ridge with alarming swiftness. As the last golden rays of sunlight retreated from the forest floor, Ethan's predicament grew increasingly desperate. The temperature was already dropping, and a damp chill began to seep through his clothing. "Think, Carter, think," he muttered through clenched teeth. His years of wilderness experience had taught him that panic was a killer more efficient than cold or injury. Drawing deep breaths to steady himself, Ethan took stock of what was within reach. His axe lay about 6 feet away, his pack with supplies even farther. With painstaking effort, he managed to drag his upper body along the ground, fingers clawing at the earth, until searing pain forced him to stop. "Not getting to that pack tonight," he concluded grimly. As darkness closed in, Ethan managed to gather handfuls of nearby leaves and moss, piling them around his torso for minimal insulation. The effort left him sweating despite the chill, his injured leg throbbing mercilessly. Night in the deep forest brought a silence so profound it seemed to have weight and substance. No distant traffic, no human voices, only the occasional rustle of nocturnal creatures awakening to their domain. The crescent moon offered little illumination through the dense canopy, leaving Ethan in near-complete darkness. Hours passed with excruciating slowness. Ethan drifted between consciousness and a hazy half-sleep filled with disjointed images. The pain in his leg had become a constant companion, dulled only slightly by the encroaching numbness of cold. Sometime in the darkest hours, a low fog began to roll through the grove, creating ghostly shapes that seemed to move among the trees. Ethan blinked hard, unsure if what he was seeing was real or a product of his increasingly delirious mind. "Hello," he called out weakly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is someone there?" Only the soft settling of mist answered him. As midnight passed, Ethan's situation deteriorated. Violent shivers racked his body as hypothermia began to take hold. His thoughts grew increasingly disjointed, and he found himself having one-sided conversations with his ex-wife, who had left Blackridge, and him, 20 years earlier. "Should have listened to Martha," he murmured to the darkness. "Should have asked permission." The sound came so suddenly that at first Ethan thought he'd imagined it. A snap of twigs at the perimeter of the clearing. Then another. Something was approaching. "Hey," he called out, hope briefly flaring. "Over here. I need help." The footfalls continued, deliberate and unhurried. Not the chaotic movement of a deer or bear, but the purposeful advance of something large. Ethan strained to see through the darkness and mist. A pair of eyes appeared first, amber orbs that caught what little moonlight filtered through the trees and reflected it back with an almost phosphorescent glow. They were positioned about 4 feet off the ground and moved steadily closer until the creature's form gradually materialized from the darkness. It was a wolf, the largest Ethan had ever seen. Its coat was black as coal, making its body nearly invisible in the night, a moving shadow defined only by its gleaming eyes and the silver-gray ruff around its massive neck. The animal was easily twice the size of the timber wolves Ethan had occasionally glimpsed in his years working the forests further north. Terror seized Ethan's chest. Trapped and injured, he was the definition of vulnerable prey. He looked frantically for anything he might use as a weapon, but even his axe remained beyond reach. The wolf stopped about 15 feet away, its breath creating small clouds in the cold air. For a long, suspended moment, it simply watched him, head slightly tilted as if assessing the situation. There was an unsettling intelligence in its gaze. "Go on, get out of here." Ethan tried to sound authoritative, but his voice cracked with fear and exhaustion. The wolf didn't flinch. Instead, it lowered its head and took several more steps forward, powerful muscles rippling beneath its dark coat. Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs. This close, he could see that the animal was even larger than he'd first thought. Easily 150 pounds of predator, with paws the size of his hand. "I'm not dying like this," Ethan growled, grabbing a stone from the ground beside him and hurling it weakly at the wolf. The projectile fell short, but the wolf stopped its advance. To Ethan's astonishment, it sat on its haunches, those eerie amber eyes never leaving his face. The standoff continued for several minutes, until Ethan's terror gradually gave way to confusion. "What do you want?" he whispered, more to himself than to the animal. As if in response, the wolf rose and began moving again, not toward Ethan, but in a wide circle around him, examining the fallen tree and the trapped man from all angles. When it completed its circuit, the wolf approached the massive branch pinning Ethan's legs and began to sniff along its length. A wild, impossible thought crossed Ethan's mind. "You can't be serious," he said aloud. The wolf looked directly at him, and Ethan could have sworn something like purpose flashed in those inhuman eyes. Then, with deliberate movements, the animal began to dig at the ground where the branch met the earth, powerful front paws excavating dirt with surprising efficiency. Ethan watched in stunned disbelief as the wolf continued to dig, occasionally circling to another spot to repeat the process. After nearly 30 minutes of this behavior, the animal moved to the thickest part of the branch and pressed its shoulder against the wood. With a low growl of effort, it pushed. The branch shifted slightly. Pain flared through Ethan's injured leg, drawing a gasp from his lips. The wolf paused, those amber eyes finding his again before returning to its task. It dug more dirt from beneath the branch, creating space that allowed for movement, then pushed again with renewed effort. This time, the branch rolled several inches. "Keep going," Ethan encouraged, his earlier fear replaced by desperate hope. "Just a little more." As if understanding his words, the wolf redoubled its efforts, alternating between digging and pushing until, with a final heave of its powerful body, the branch rolled clear of Ethan's legs. The sudden release sent fresh waves of agony through his broken limb, causing black spots to dance before his eyes. When his vision cleared, Ethan found the wolf standing over him, its massive head lowered until they were almost face to face, its breath warm against his cold skin. In that moment, looking into those ancient eyes, Ethan experienced a sensation he couldn't explain, a connection that transcended the natural order of predator and prey. There was a presence behind those eyes, something older and wiser than any animal had the right to be. "Thank you," he whispered, the words feeling simultaneously foolish and profoundly inadequate. The wolf stepped back, then looked pointedly toward the darkened trail before returning its gaze to Ethan. The meaning seemed clear. With excruciating effort, Ethan pulled himself up to a sitting position. His left leg was definitely broken. Even the slightest movement sent shards of pain shooting through him. Walking was out of the question, but perhaps he could crawl to his pack, retrieve his emergency radio. The wolf growled softly, drawing Ethan's attention. Again, it looked toward the trail, then back at him. When Ethan made no move to follow, the animal approached and gently nudged his shoulder with its muzzle. "You want me to follow you?" Ethan asked incredulously. "I can't walk, in case you hadn't noticed." The wolf moved closer, positioning its large body beside Ethan, then lowered itself slightly. Understanding dawned slowly. "No way," Ethan breathed. "This isn't happening." But with no better options and the cold growing more dangerous by the hour, Ethan found himself reaching for the wolf's thick fur. Using the animal's solid frame for support, he painfully pulled himself upright, keeping all weight off his broken leg. The wolf stood perfectly still during this process, its powerful body becoming a living crutch for the injured man. Once Ethan was stable, it began to move forward slowly, matching its pace to his hobbling progress. Together, man and wolf began their strange journey through the midnight forest, leaving behind the fallen oak as fog continued to swirl around the ancient grove like spirits disturbed from their slumber. Retry O Continue Edit Chapter 5. The supernatural rescue. The journey through the night-cloaked forest was surreal. Each painful step required complete concentration as Ethan leaned heavily against the wolf's sturdy frame. What should have been a 4-hour hike would clearly take much longer in his injured state. The wolf moved with deliberate patience, adjusting its pace whenever Ethan faltered. "Never thought I'd be using a wolf as a crutch," Ethan muttered through gritted teeth. Nobody back in town would believe this. His injured leg dragged uselessly behind him, sending jolts of agony up his spine with every uneven section of trail. Despite the cold, sweat poured down his face from the exertion. Several times he had to stop, sagging against the nearest tree trunk, his breathing ragged. During one such rest, Ethan fumbled in his pocket and found Martha's leather pouch still tucked inside. The absurdity of his situation struck him. Here he was, a practical man who had scoffed at local superstitions, now being led through the forest by a wolf that seemed to understand exactly what he needed. "Bearberry and cedar to keep my wits about me," he said with a pained chuckle. "Guess I should have taken the whole jar, Martha." The wolf turned its head at the sound of the woman's name, amber eyes reflecting the faint moonlight that filtered through the canopy. "Yeah, we're talking about the same Martha," Ethan said, feeling slightly ridiculous for conversing with the animal. "Seems she knew more than I gave her credit for." As if in response, the wolf nudged his hand gently with its muzzle, urging him to continue. Hours passed in this manner, the forest gradually transforming around them as they descended from the ridge. Ethan's world narrowed to a haze of pain, cold, and the constant presence of the wolf beside him. He began to lose track of time and direction, trusting wholly in his unusual guide. Just before dawn, when the eastern sky began to lighten from black to deep blue, Ethan's strength finally gave out. His good leg buckled beneath him, and he collapsed to the forest floor, unable to rise again. "Can't go further," he gasped, shivering violently as shock and exhaustion overtook him. The wolf stood over him, a massive shadow against the pre-dawn sky. It nudged him insistently, but Ethan couldn't respond. His consciousness was fading, his body surrendering to the cold and trauma. Through half-closed eyes, Ethan watched as the wolf threw back its head and released a long, haunting howl that echoed through the silent forest. The sound penetrated the fog of Ethan's mind, reverberating not just in his ears, but somehow through his very bones. It was followed by a second howl, then a third, each seeming to carry a different tone, a different message. Minutes passed, or perhaps it was longer. Ethan drifted in and out of awareness, vaguely registering that the wolf remained by his side, its warm body pressed against his, sharing what heat it could. He was roused by the sound of approaching footsteps and a familiar voice calling his name. "Ethan Carter, can you hear me?" Martha Holloway emerged from the trees, dressed in a heavy coat with a lantern in one hand and a walking staff in the other. Her silver braid hung over one shoulder, and her expression was a mixture of concern and something else, a knowing look that suggested she wasn't entirely surprised to find him here. "Martha," Ethan croaked, wondering if he was hallucinating. She knelt beside him, her weathered hands quickly assessing his condition with professional efficiency. "Broken tibia, maybe fibula too," she muttered. "Hypothermia setting in." "How did you?" Ethan began, then his eyes sought the wolf. To his astonishment, The animal stood just at the edge of the clearing, watching them intently. Martha followed his gaze, and a soft smile touched her lips. "He found you, then," she said simply, as if finding a man in the vast forest was a perfectly ordinary accomplishment for a wild animal. "You knew," Ethan managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Martha didn't answer directly. Instead, she turned toward the wolf and inclined her head slightly. "Thank you for bringing him this far. I'll take him the rest of the way." To Ethan's continued amazement, the wolf seemed to respond to her words, dipping its massive head in what looked remarkably like a nod of acknowledgement before melting back into the forest shadows. "Wait," Ethan called weakly after the departing animal, but it was gone. Martha was already pulling supplies from her pack, a flask of something steaming, bandages, and a collapsible stretcher. "Drink this," she ordered, holding the flask to his lips. Willow bark tea with a few other things for the pain. The liquid was bitter, but warming. As it spread through his system, Ethan felt the edge of his pain begin to dull slightly. "That wolf," he said, needing to make sense of what had happened. "It dug me out, helped me walk. No wild animal acts like that." Martha's hands were gentle but firm as she began splinting his injured leg. "No ordinary animal, perhaps," she agreed. "What are you saying?" Martha paused in her work, her hazel eyes meeting his directly. "The guardians of the ridge have protected these mountains since before recorded history. The Cherokee called them Aniwaya, the wolf people, spirits that take physical form when needed." Under normal circumstances, Ethan would have dismissed such talk immediately. But after what he'd experienced, the wolf's intelligent eyes, its deliberate actions, the way it had responded to Martha's words, he found himself unable to form a rational explanation. "That's not possible," he said, though his conviction was hollow even to his own ears. "And yet, here you are," Martha replied simply. She whistled sharply, and to Ethan's surprise, two men emerged from the forest path, locals he recognized from town, Phil Dawson and his son Jake, carrying additional medical supplies. "Found him, I see," Phil said, nodding to Martha. "How did you know to come looking?" Ethan asked as they transferred him carefully onto the stretcher. Phil and Jake exchanged glances. "Martha came pounding on our door before sunrise," Jake explained. "Said you were injured on the North Trail and needed help fast." "I heard the call," Martha said quietly, for Ethan's ears alone. "The same way I've heard it other times when people are in trouble in these woods." As they began the careful journey back to civilization, Ethan found himself looking back over his shoulder, half expecting to glimpse a large black shape following their progress. The forest remained still, yet he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, not with malice, but with a profound and ancient awareness. "The tree I cut," he said suddenly, remembering. "It wasn't the one you warned me about, Martha. I chose another." Martha's expression softened. "I know. He wouldn't have helped you otherwise. But how did you know which tree?" "Rest now," she interrupted gently. "Save your strength. There will be time for explanations when you're healed." As the rescue party made their slow way through the awakening forest, Ethan Carter gazed up at the canopy where dawn light was beginning to filter through the leaves. For the first time in decades, he saw the forest not merely as a resource to be harvested, but as something alive in ways he had never before considered. Something that watched and judged, and sometimes, when the balance tipped in your favor, saved. The leather pouch Martha had given him remained clutched in his hand, a tangible connection to mysteries he was only beginning to comprehend. Retry O Continue Edit Chapter 6. The journey of return and the unexpected destination. Martha's cabin appeared different to Ethan in daylight than it had during his brief visit the previous day. What had seemed merely rustic now revealed careful intentionality in its construction. The walls were chinked with a reddish clay mixed with what looked like crushed herbs. Strange symbols had been carved subtly into the wooden door frame and window sills, not obvious enough to draw attention from casual visitors, but unmistakable once noticed. Inside, Ethan lay on a narrow bed near the stone fireplace, his splinted leg propped on pillows. 3 days had passed since his rescue. The local doctor, Alan Mercer, had driven out from town to set his broken tibia and fibula properly, but it was Martha who oversaw his recovery, applying poultices to reduce swelling and brewing teas that dulled the pain, without clouding his mind like the prescription painkillers Dr. Mercer had left. "You're lucky," Martha said, changing the herbal wrap on his leg. Another night out there, and we might have been looking at amputation. Ethan watched her methodical movements. The questions that had been building inside him since his rescue finally overflowed. That wolf, he began. You talk to it like it understands you. Martha's hands didn't pause in their work. He understands more than most humans give credit for. But it's not just a wolf, is it? Ethan pressed. No wild animal behaves that way. It solved problems, responded to words. Martha straightened, fixing him with those penetrating hazel eyes. What do you think it was, Ethan Carter? The question hung in the air between them. Ethan had spent his life believing in what he could see, touch, and explain. Yet his experience in the forest defied rational explanation. I don't know, he admitted, the words difficult for a man accustomed to certainty. But I know what I saw. Martha nodded, seeming satisfied with his answer. Some things in this world exist beyond our understanding. Doesn't make them any less real. She moved to her shelves of herbs, selecting several jars. The Guardians have watched over these mountains for generations. Most people never see them. Some, like you, encounter them when in dire need. Very few ever come to know them. And you? A small, enigmatic smile crossed Martha's face. My grandmother was Cherokee, from the eastern band that remained when others were forced west. She taught me the old ways, the old stories. When I came to Blackridge after my husband died, it wasn't by chance. Ethan tried to absorb this information. So this, Guardian, it saved me because I didn't cut the split trunk oak? Because I respected the forest? Partly, Martha allowed, but also because you were meant to be saved. There are patterns at work that go beyond simple cause and effect, Ethan. Before he could question her further, a knock came at the door. Pastor Samuel entered, his thin face etched with concern and relief at the sight of Ethan awake and alert. Thank the Lord you're recovering, Samuel said, placing a basket of food from the church ladies on the table. When Phil and Jake brought you into town half-frozen, I feared the worst. I'm tougher than I look, Pastor, Ethan replied with a wan smile. Indeed you are. Samuel settled into a chair, his eyes moving curiously around Martha's cabin. Martha has been kind enough to take you in while you heal. The whole town's grateful. Martha merely nodded, continuing her work with the herbs. About the altar wood, Samuel began hesitantly. Please don't concern yourself with it now. We can wait until the tree fell. Ethan interrupted. It's there on the north ridge, ready to be harvested. I just couldn't bring it back myself. Samuel's eyes widened. You managed to fell it before the accident? That's wonderful news. I'll organize some men to retrieve it right away. They'll need the exact location, Ethan said. I can draw a map. I'll guide them. Martha interjected, surprising both men. I know where to find it. Samuel seemed momentarily taken aback by her offer, but quickly recovered. That's very generous, Martha. Thank you. He turned back to Ethan. Did you experience anything unusual up there? On the ridge. The question caught Ethan off guard. Unusual how? Samuel shifted uncomfortably. Oh, just old stories. Nothing important. He stood, straightening his jacket. I should let you rest. Is there anything you need from your cabin? I'd be happy to bring it over. After the pastor left, promising to return with Ethan's requested items, a contemplative silence filled the cabin. Finally, Ethan turned to Martha. What stories was Samuel referring to? About the ridge? Martha sighed, settling into the chair the pastor had vacated. Every small town has its tales. Blackridge is no different. She stared into the fire. Some stories say that the earliest settlers made agreements with the forest, promises that have been kept or broken through generations. What kind of agreements? The kind that allow a town to exist alongside something ancient and powerful, she replied. Balance, respect, boundaries. She looked at him pointedly. The kind your ancestors understood, Ethan Carter. My ancestors? Ethan frowned. What do you mean? Martha rose and crossed to an old trunk in the corner. After rummaging briefly, she returned with a leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. I believe this belongs to your family, though I doubt you've ever seen it. Ethan took the book carefully. The cover bore no title, only a simple embossed design of a tree with spreading roots. Opening it, he found the first page inscribed with a name that made his breath catch. Elizabeth Carter, 1842. My great-great-grandmother, he whispered, running his fingers over the faded script. The first keeper of your family line, Martha confirmed. She documented everything. the history of the Guardians, the pact between the settlers and the forest, the responsibilities of those chosen to maintain the balance. Ethan flipped through the pages with growing astonishment. The journal contained detailed writings, sketches of plants and animals, and maps of the forest with areas marked by symbols he didn't recognize. Many entries described encounters with beings called the Guardians, wolves, eagles, deer, and bears that were more than mere animals. "How did you get this?" he asked, unable to tear his eyes from the journal. "Your grandmother gave it to my grandmother for safekeeping during difficult times. It was meant to be returned to a Carter who could understand its importance." Martha's voice softened. "I've been waiting for the right time to give it to you since you returned to Blackridge 15 years ago." Ethan looked up sharply. "You knew all this time that I was, what? Some kind of chosen guardian?" "Not chosen, born," Martha corrected. "The responsibility passes through bloodlines. Not everyone is called to acknowledge it, but the potential is there." She nodded toward his splinted leg. "Some calls are louder than others." A memory surfaced. Ethan as a young boy, wandering too far into the forest, becoming hopelessly lost as darkness fell. He remembered his terror, then the appearance of a massive black wolf that had led him home before disappearing at the edge of town. His parents had dismissed the story as childhood imagination, and eventually, Ethan himself had come to doubt the memory. "I've seen it before," he said slowly. "When I was a child." Martha nodded, unsurprised. The first encounter often comes in childhood. Most forget or rationalize it away as they grow older. "Why me? Why now?" "The forest is under threat. Development, logging, climate change, the balance is shifting. The Guardians need their human counterparts more than ever." Martha gestured to the journal. "Read it. Learn what your family has known for generations. Then decide what role you wish to play." As the evening deepened, Ethan immersed himself in the journal, discovering a hidden history of his own family and the land they had inhabited for nearly 2 centuries. The writings revealed a symbiotic relationship between certain families in Blackridge and the forest's ancient protectors, a partnership of stewardship that had ensured the prosperity of both. Outside Martha's window, the forest loomed dark and vast. Once or twice, Ethan thought he glimpsed a shadow moving among the trees, larger than any normal wolf. He found himself wondering not when he could return to his solitary cabin, but what new path might be unfolding before him, one that had been waiting for him to discover it his entire life. Retry O Continue Edit Chapter 7. The Diary of the Guardians and the Call of the Forest. A week passed in Martha's cabin. Ethan's physical healing progressed steadily under her care, but it was the inner transformation that marked the greater change. Each day, he delved deeper into Elizabeth Carter's journal, discovering the rich history of his family's connection to the Guardians of the Ridge. "I never knew any of this," Ethan said one evening as Martha stoked the fire. "My father never mentioned it, nor my grandfather." Martha added another log to the flames. The knowledge skipped some generations. Times changed. People moved away from the old beliefs. Your grandfather was more interested in modern forestry than ancient pacts. She settled into her chair with a cup of tea. But your grandmother remembered. She used to leave offerings at the old stone circle during the changing seasons. Ethan looked up from the journal. I remember her taking me into the woods for picnics at specific times of year. She would always bring extra food that we'd leave behind. I thought it was for the animals. In a way, it was, Martha replied with a slight smile. The journal had revealed that the Carters had once been the primary keepers in Blackridge, families entrusted with maintaining the boundary between the human world and the wilderness. They served as intermediaries, ensuring that the town's needs were met while protecting the ancient places from encroachment. In return, the Guardians, animal spirits embodied in flesh, watched over the town, preventing natural disasters and guiding lost travelers to safety. But as industrialization spread and old beliefs faded, the pact had weakened. Fewer and fewer people acknowledged the Guardians or observed the traditional practices. The journal entries from the early 1900s spoke of growing concern as the balance shifted. The most recent entry, dated 1982 and written by Ethan's grandmother, expressed fear that the line of keepers might end, as none of her children or grandchildren seemed to inherit the sensitivity to perceive the Guardians. She meant me, Ethan realized, closing the journal. She thought I might be the last Carter with the ability, but she died before she could teach me. Martha nodded. She saw your potential, the way you connected with the forest even as a child, how animals responded to you. But your parents were practical people. They discouraged what they saw as fanciful thinking. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant call of an owl outside. Finally, Ethan voiced the question that had been growing in his mind. If I wanted to acknowledge this heritage, what would it mean? Martha studied him carefully. It would mean seeing the world differently, recognizing the threads that connect all living things, taking responsibility for maintaining balance in your own way. She paused. And it might mean occasional service when called upon by those who have guarded these mountains since time immemorial. Like being rescued when a tree falls on you? Ethan asked with a wry smile. Among other things, Martha replied, her expression serious despite his attempt at humor. The guardians don't interfere often, but when they do, it's never without purpose. She rose and crossed to an old cedar chest in the corner of the cabin, returning with a folded piece of parchment, yellowed with age. Your grandmother left this with me as well. It's a map to a place few remember exists. Ethan unfolded the parchment carefully. The map was hand-drawn in faded ink, depicting the ridge and surrounding areas with remarkable detail. A winding path led to a circular clearing marked with an unfamiliar symbol. The meeting place, Martha explained. A stone circle older than any written record of this region. The Cherokee considered it sacred ground, a doorway between worlds. Before them, other peoples held it in similar regard. She traced the path with her finger. When you're strong enough to walk, this is where you need to go. Why? Because you've been summoned, she said simply. The wolf could have guided you back to town or even to your own cabin. Instead, it brought you here, to me and to your family's legacy. That was deliberate. Ethan studied the map, trying to orient himself. This location, it's not far from where I was cutting the tree. The oldest and most powerful places in the forest are connected, Martha confirmed. Your accident happened near a boundary that's been thinning for decades. The Guardians are reaching out more urgently now. Over the next few days, as Ethan's strength returned and he graduated from bed rest to moving about with a makeshift crutch, he continued to read the journal. The detailed accounts of his ancestors' encounters with the Guardians fascinated him. Stories of wolves that led lost children home, eagles that warned of approaching storms, deer that guided hunters to sustainable game while leading them away from breeding grounds. One entry particularly caught his attention, his great-grandfather describing how he had followed a massive black wolf to the stone circle during a time of drought. There, he had been shown visions of underground springs that, once tapped, had saved the town's crops. In gratitude, the town had preserved a section of the ridge from logging. The same section where Ethan had encountered his accident. They're intelligent, Ethan said to Martha one morning as she changed his bandages. Not just instinctual. The journal describes them communicating, understanding human speech, even showing foresight. They're ancient consciousnesses that take physical form when needed, Martha explained. Neither fully spirit nor fully animal, but something in between. And they chose my family to be their human connections. They chose several families, each with different roles. The Carters were always the bridge, those who could walk in both worlds and understand both sides. Martha secured the fresh bandage. There were others. The Winters family, Pastor Samuel's ancestors, were once the voice who shared the wisdom of the forest with the town through their sermons. The Holloways, my husband's family, were the healers, using the forest's gifts to tend both the land and its people. Ethan's eyebrows rose. Samuel? He knows about all this. His grandfather was the last to actively serve as voice. Samuel has chosen a more conventional path. Martha's tone held no judgment, merely observation. Few remember the old ways now. Just fragments, stories told around campfires, superstitions that people follow without knowing why. As his recovery progressed, Ethan spent hours studying the map, committing its details to memory. According to the journal, the stone circle was most accessible during certain times, dawn, dusk, and under the full moon. The next full moon was just 5 days away. I want to go then, Ethan told Martha. To the circle. She assessed him with a professional eye. Your leg is healing well, but it's still too soon for such a journey. I'll use crutches, he insisted. The journal says the full moon in spring is especially significant, a time when the veil between worlds is thinnest. Martha seemed to wrestle with herself before finally nodding. I can guide you part of the way, but the final approach to the circle must be made alone. That's tradition. On the evening of the full moon, they set out just before sunset. Ethan moved slowly with his crutches, but with determination. The forest felt different to him now, not merely a collection of trees and wildlife, but a living entity with awareness. Perhaps it had always been so, and he had simply lacked the eyes to see it. At a stream crossing about a mile from the stone circle, Martha stopped. "This is as far as I go," she said, handing him a small leather bundle. "Take these offerings: cedar for purification, tobacco for respect, cornmeal for gratitude. Place them at the 4 cardinal points of the circle." Ethan accepted the bundle, suddenly feeling the weight of generations of tradition. "What should I expect?" Martha's expression softened. "That depends on what the Guardians wish to show you. Go with an open heart and mind. The rest will follow." As they prepared to part ways, Martha placed a hand on his arm. "One more thing, Ethan. The journal you've been reading, it's not just a record of the past. It's meant to be continued." Ethan nodded, understanding. "If I accept this role, I'm to document it for those who come after." "The circle remains unbroken that way," she confirmed. "Knowledge passed from hand to hand, generation to generation." With that, Ethan continued alone along the path marked on the ancient map, the full moon rising above the trees to light his way. The forest seemed to respond to his presence differently now. Branches moved aside more easily. Roots didn't catch his crutches. The normally confusing underbrush appeared to form a clearer path before him. By the time he reached the clearing with the stone circle, the moon had risen fully above the ridge, bathing the ancient site in silver light. 12 standing stones, each about waist-high, formed a perfect circle around a central flat altar stone. The clearing itself was perfectly round, as if the forest had deliberately withdrawn to create this sacred space. Following the instructions from the journal, Ethan moved slowly around the perimeter, placing the offerings at the north, east, south, and west stones. As he completed the circuit, he felt rather than heard a change in the forest, a deepening of the silence, a sense of anticipation. Leaning on his crutches, he waited in the center of the circle, uncertain what would happen next. Minutes passed, and then, at the edge of the clearing, a pair of amber eyes appeared, reflecting the moonlight. The black wolf emerged from the trees, its massive form somehow even more impressive than Ethan remembered. This time, Ethan felt no fear, only a profound sense of recognition. "You saved my life," he said quietly. "I've come to understand why." The wolf approached slowly, circling him once before sitting directly before him, its intelligent gaze never leaving his face. Behind it, at the edge of the clearing, more shapes began to materialize. A majestic elk with towering antlers, a golden eagle perched on one of the standing stones, and a silver-gray fox with unusually bright eyes. The Guardians of the Ridge had answered his call. As the moonlight intensified, Ethan Carter stood at the threshold of 2 worlds, ready to reclaim his family's legacy and forge a new connection between the people of Blackridge and the ancient protectors of the forest. Retry O Continue Edit Chapter 8. The journey to the heart of the forest, the stone circle, seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy as Ethan stood before the assembled Guardians. The black wolf remained closest, its amber eyes reflecting not just moonlight, but a depth of awareness that transcended its animal form. The massive elk stood regally at the northeastern edge of the circle, antlers like a crown of branches against the night sky. The golden eagle perched silently, its fierce gaze missing nothing, while the silver fox sat on its haunches, head tilted in what appeared to be curiosity. Ethan's throat felt dry. The journal had described such gatherings, but experiencing it firsthand left him momentarily speechless. Finally, drawing on his ancestors' writings, he spoke the traditional words of greeting. "I come with respect to those who watch over these mountains. I am Ethan Carter, of the Carter line, and I acknowledge the ancient bond between my family and the Guardians of the Ridge." The wolf rose and approached him, moving with deliberate grace until it stood directly before him. Up close, Ethan could see subtle markings in its black fur, swirls of silver around its eyes and throat that seemed to form patterns similar to those carved into the standing stones. What happened next would forever change Ethan's understanding of the world. The wolf's eyes locked with his, and suddenly, Ethan was no longer standing in the clearing. Instead, he found himself experiencing a cascade of visions, moving through them as both observer and participant. He saw the ridge as it had been centuries ago, before European settlement, watched by the same guardians in an unbroken line of stewardship. He witnessed the arrival of the first white settlers, including his own ancestors, and the tense early interactions with the Cherokee already living in harmony with the land. He felt the fear and uncertainty on both sides. Then the slow building of respect as his forefather, James Carter, saved a Cherokee child from drowning and was in turn guided from a blizzard by the Black Wolf. The visions shifted to show the formalization of the pact between select families and the Guardians, a ceremony held in this very stone circle under a full moon much like tonight's. He saw generations of Carters serving as intermediaries, ensuring sustainable hunting and logging practices, preserving sacred spaces, mediating conflicts between human needs and forest preservation. Then came darker images, the forced removal of most Cherokee, the Civil War bringing violence even to these remote mountains, the industrial logging operations that scarred entire ridges. Through it all, the Guardians watched and sometimes intervened, but their influence waned as fewer humans acknowledged their existence or respected the old agreements. The timeline accelerated to more recent decades. Ethan saw his grandmother visiting the circle, bringing offerings, teaching a young boy, himself, to identify plants and animal tracks. Then her passing, and the near-complete severance of the connection as his father embraced modern forestry techniques, and Ethan himself left Blackridge to work commercial logging operations across the country. The final images were of the present day, new threats to the forest from climate change, development pressures as wealthy outsiders discovered the beauty of the mountains, the old knowledge fading as elders passed without transmitting their wisdom. He saw Martha Holloway, standing alone at the circle during solstices and equinoxes, maintaining what traditions she could as one of the last who remembered. With a dizzying shift, Ethan returned to his physical body, nearly losing balance on his crutches. The wolf still stood before him, but now Ethan understood much more about who he was facing. "You've been waiting," Ethan said quietly. "All these years, you've been waiting for a Carter to return to the circle." The wolf made a sound, not quite a growl, not quite a whine, that seemed to convey affirmation. "What do you want from me?" Ethan asked, though he already suspected the answer. In response, the wolf turned and walked to the central altar stone. Using its muzzle, it indicated a shallow depression in the rock that Ethan hadn't noticed before. Looking closer, he saw that it was carved in the shape of a human hand, specifically, a left hand, like his own. The journal had mentioned this moment, the offering of commitment, where a keeper would renew the pact by placing their hand in the sacred hollow. The implications of such an act were significant. According to his ancestors' writings, it would formalize his role as bridge between worlds, binding him to responsibilities that would shape the rest of his life. Ethan hesitated, thoughts racing. He had built his identity around independence and self-reliance. Taking on this role would tie him permanently to Blackridge and to obligations he was only beginning to understand. As if sensing his uncertainty, the elk stepped forward. Like the wolf before it, it established some form of mental connection, and Ethan found himself experiencing a new series of visions. But these showed possible futures rather than the past. He saw Blackridge and the surrounding forest in decades to come. In one timeline, the ridge was parceled into vacation homes, the ancient trees cut for lumber or view corridors, the streams polluted by runoff. The town itself became a shell, either abandoned as the local economy collapsed or transformed into a tourist trap with no connection to its heritage. The Guardians faded to mere legends, then were forgotten entirely. In another possible future, he saw the forest preserved, not as an untouched wilderness, but as a living system in balance with human communities. The town thrived, drawing strength from sustainable relationships with the land. Young people stayed or returned, learning traditional skills alongside modern innovations. The Guardians remained, their bond with human partners ensuring mutual protection during floods, fires, and other challenges. The contrast was stark and compelling. When the visions faded, Ethan found himself looking at the hand-shaped depression with new understanding. "This isn't just about tradition, is it?" he asked, addressing all the assembled guardians. "It's about survival, yours and ours." The eagle spread its magnificent wings in what seemed like confirmation, while the fox yipped softly. Ethan thought of his solitary life, his decades of wandering, his return to Blackridge seeking something he couldn't name. Perhaps this had been waiting for him all along, not a burden, but a purpose. Moving carefully with his crutches, he approached the altar stone. After a moment's hesitation, he placed his left hand into the depression. It fit perfectly, as if carved for him alone. The moment his palm touched the stone, Ethan felt a surge of energy travel up his arm and spread throughout his body. It wasn't painful, but rather like a current connecting him to something vast and ancient. The stone grew warm beneath his hand, and in his mind, he heard, or perhaps felt, words that weren't quite sound. The bridge is restored. The circle continues. When he finally withdrew his hand, Ethan noticed something that made his breath catch. A faint pattern of swirling lines had appeared on his palm, similar to the markings in the wolf's fur. According to the journal, this was the sign of the keeper, visible only to those with eyes to see it. The black wolf approached once more and gently pressed its forehead against Ethan's free hand, a gesture of acceptance and partnership. One by one, the other guardians acknowledged him in their own ways, the elk bowing its great head, the eagle dipping its wings, the fox circling his feet once before returning to its position. As the ceremony concluded, Ethan felt both exhausted and exhilarated. The visions had shown him not only his heritage, but his potential path forward. The role of bridge would not be easy, especially in modern times when so few remembered the old ways. But it offered a chance to heal relationships between humans and nature, between progress and preservation, between past and future. Looking at the guardians arrayed before him, Ethan made a silent promise to honor the trust they had placed in him. He would need to learn much more, from Martha, from his grandmother's journal, from the forest itself, but for the first time in years, he felt the certainty of right path. The full moon had reached its zenith, bathing the stone circle in silver light. In this timeless moment, on this ancient ground, Ethan Carter had found not just his family's legacy, but his own purpose. The journey ahead would be challenging, requiring him to bridge worlds that had grown too far apart, but he would not walk it alone. As if reading his thoughts, the wolf, his wolf now, in some profound sense, moved to his side, ready to guide him back through the night forest toward Martha's cabin, where the next chapter of his journey would begin. Retry O Continue Edit Chapter 9. The vision and the choice of the guardian. The days following Ethan's experience at the stone circle were filled with intense dreams and moments of startling clarity. He returned to Martha's cabin that night, guided once again by the black wolf, who remained with him until the edge of the cleared area around her home. Martha had been waiting on the porch, somehow knowing when he would return, a cup of hot tea ready to warm him after his journey. "You've accepted the role," she said simply, not a question but an observation. Ethan nodded, showing her the barely visible pattern on his palm. "I've never felt anything like it. It was as if I could hear the forest breathe." The veil was lifted, Martha confirmed, pouring him more tea. "Your eyes are open now in ways they cannot be closed again." By the end of the week, Ethan was strong enough to return to his own cabin, though he made daily trips to Martha's to continue learning from her extensive knowledge. She taught him to identify the signs left by guardians, certain arrangements of stones or branches that marked boundaries or indicated danger, weather patterns that held meaning beyond meteorological explanation, the behaviors of ordinary animals that sometimes served as messengers for their more extraordinary counterparts. Not all messages come directly from the guardians themselves, Martha explained as they walked slowly through the woods near her cabin, Ethan still using a single crutch for support. Most often, they speak through intermediaries, regular wolves, eagles, or deer that respond to their influence. You must learn to distinguish between ordinary animal behavior and signs meant for you. As Ethan's leg continued to heal, news of his accident and recovery spread through Blackridge. Visitors came to check on him, bringing food and good wishes. Pastor Samuel arrived with several church members who had retrieved the oak Ethan had felled. "It's perfect for the altar," Samuel told him earnestly. "The grain is exceptional, almost seems to tell a story in the wood." Ethan smiled at this unintentional insight. All trees tell stories if you know how to listen. The pastor gave him an odd look, but didn't pursue the comment. Nearly 3 weeks after his night at the stone circle, Ethan felt strong enough to make the hike to his felling site on the North Ridge. He needed to see it again, to understand what had happened there with clearer eyes. Martha offered to accompany him, but this was a journey he felt he needed to make alone. The trail seemed different now. Where once he had seen merely timber and terrain, he now noticed subtle markers. A bent sapling here, 3 stones stacked there, signs he would have previously overlooked but now recognized as trail markers left by guardians or their human allies over generations. When he reached the fallen oak, Ethan was surprised to find the site transformed. New growth had already begun around the stump, and the forest floor where he had lain trapped was covered with a carpet of white trillium flowers, uncommon for that elevation and unusual in their density. Life from death, he murmured, understanding the message in this natural resurrection. He continued past his accident site to where the split-trunk oak stood, the tree Martha had warned him not to cut. Now, looking at it with informed eyes, he could see why. The double trunk formed a natural archway, and the bark pattern contained the same swirling symbols he had seen on the wolf and now faintly on his own palm. This was no ordinary tree, but a living marker of a boundary between mundane and sacred spaces. As Ethan stood contemplating the tree, a subtle shift in the air alerted him to a presence. Turning slowly, he found the black wolf watching him from a short distance away. "I wondered if I'd see you again," Ethan said. The wolf approached, its movements conveying a sense of purpose. When it reached him, it gently butted its head against his hand, the one bearing the keeper's mark, before turning to look deeper into the forest beyond the split-trunk oak. "You want me to follow?" Ethan concluded. Moving with more confidence now despite his healing leg, Ethan ducked through the natural archway of the split oak. Immediately, he sensed a difference in the forest on the other side. The colors seemed richer, the sounds clearer, the scents more distinct. It was still the same Blackridge forest he had known all his life, yet somehow more intensely itself, as if experiencing it through heightened senses. The wolf led him along a path that seemed to materialize before them, winding through stands of ancient trees that Ethan, despite his extensive knowledge of the local forest, couldn't recall ever seeing before. After about 20 minutes of walking, they emerged into an extraordinary glade. The clearing was perfectly circular, ringed by 7 massive oak trees that must have been growing for centuries. At its center stood a single white pine of impossible proportions, at least 200 feet tall, its lower branches beginning 50 feet up the trunk. The forest floor was covered with lush moss interspersed with medicinal plants that Martha had taught him to recognize: ginseng, bloodroot, black cohosh, all growing with unusual vigor. As Ethan stood taking in this hidden marvel, the other guardians began to emerge from the surrounding forest. The majestic elk, the golden eagle now perched on a low branch of the central pine, and the silver fox. But they were not alone. A massive black bear ambled into the clearing, followed by a mountain lion of impressive size. Both moved with the same uncanny intelligence he had observed in the other guardians. The full assembly of guardians formed a circle around Ethan and the black wolf. There was purpose in their arrangement, a deliberate ceremony unfolding. The wolf moved to stand directly before Ethan, and once again, the mental connection established itself. This time, the visions were not of past or possible futures, but of present concerns throughout the forest domain. Ethan saw specific threats: a new development plan for the southwestern slope that would disrupt a critical watershed, diseased trees in the eastern section that needed attention before the infection spread, an abandoned mine whose toxic seepage was reaching a level that would soon poison groundwater. The visions shifted to show him people in the community whose actions or knowledge were particularly relevant. A retired biologist who had moved to Blackridge recently and was documenting changing bird migrations. A teenager with an intuitive gift for finding medicinal plants. An elderly man who still practiced traditional methods of coppicing and forest management learned from his grandfather. Finally, the visions turned to Ethan himself, showing him not as he was, but as he could be. A bridge walking between worlds, using his influence in the human community to protect critical areas while ensuring sustainable use of others, teaching younger generations the signs and ways of the forest, working with the Guardians to heal damaged places and strengthen the bond between human and wild. When the mental connection faded, Ethan found himself kneeling in the moss, overwhelmed by the clarity and purpose of what he had been shown. The wolf stood patient beside him, allowing him time to absorb the experience. "I understand now," Ethan said finally, slowly rising to his feet. "This isn't just about rituals or traditions. It's about practical action, being your eyes and hands in the human world." The wolf made a soft sound of affirmation. "But I can't do it alone," Ethan continued, thinking aloud. "The old network of keeper families has mostly forgotten their roles. We need to rebuild those connections, carefully revive that knowledge." The bear huffed and shifted its weight, drawing Ethan's attention. As he looked at the massive creature, a new understanding formed in his mind. Not as clear as the wolf's visions, but an impression of meaning. Some will be ready to remember. Others must find their own way to the truth. Ethan nodded, accepting this wisdom. One step at a time, then, starting with those who might be open to the possibility. The golden eagle launched suddenly from its perch, circling the glade once before landing on a fallen log near Ethan. From this closer position, he could see the intelligence in its fierce eyes, and something else, a challenge or question that formed in his mind. Will you hide what you have learned, or will you speak your truth even when others doubt? It was a profound question. Ethan had always been a private person, reserved and careful with his words. The role of bridge would require him to step forward, to speak uncomfortable truths, to potentially face ridicule from those unable to perceive what he now could. "I will speak," he promised, addressing all the assembled guardians. Not recklessly, but truthfully. Those with ears to hear will listen. The mountain lion, which had remained silent and watchful until now, approached with liquid grace. Its golden eyes held Ethan's for a long moment, and he received its message clearly. "Your strength must match ours. Your courage must equal the task." "I will not falter," Ethan replied, standing straighter despite his still healing leg. One by one, each guardian communicated with him, offering wisdom, presenting challenges, providing glimpses of knowledge long forgotten by human communities. The silver fox showed him hidden pathways through the mountains. The elk revealed migration routes and breeding grounds that needed protection. The bear shared ancestral knowledge of healing plants and sustainable harvesting. Throughout this extraordinary exchange, the black wolf remained closest to Ethan, seeming to facilitate the connections between him and the other guardians. Ethan understood that this particular guardian had chosen a special bond with him, would be his primary guide and ally in the work ahead. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the glade, the guardians formed a final circle around Ethan. The wolf approached and pressed its forehead against Ethan's chest, directly over his heart. A warmth spread through him. Not the energetic surge he had felt at the stone circle, but a deeper, more profound connection, as if a part of the forest itself had taken root within him. When he opened his eyes, the guardians were withdrawing, melting back into the forest one by one until only the black wolf remained. It gazed at him with those ancient, intelligent eyes before turning toward the path that would lead them back. As they left the sacred glade together, Ethan knew with absolute certainty that his life had irreversibly changed. He had been given not just knowledge but responsibility, to protect what was vulnerable, to sustain what was threatened, to revive what had been forgotten. The forest around him no longer seemed like a separate entity, but an extension of himself, its health intertwined with his own. The trees and stones and creatures were not merely objects in his environment, but fellow inhabitants of a shared world, each with its own purpose and voice. By the time they reached the split-trunk oak that marked the boundary, darkness had fallen. The wolf stopped, clearly indicating it would go no further. Ethan knelt beside his guardian, placing a hand on its powerful shoulder. "Thank you," he said simply, knowing words were inadequate for what had transpired between them. The wolf pressed briefly against him before turning and disappearing into the night forest, a shadow among shadows. Ethan stood watching until long after it had vanished, feeling both profoundly changed and strangely complete, as if he had finally found a missing piece of himself. As he made his way back toward Blackridge, the forest night alive around him with sounds and sensations he now perceived with newfound clarity, Ethan Carter began to plan how he would honor the commitment he had made. how he would become the bridge between worlds that his ancestors had been and that his community once again needed. Retry O Continue Edit Chapter 10. The return to the village and the new legacy. The late spring sun warmed Ethan's face as he sat on his cabin porch, whittling a piece of cedar wood with practiced strokes. 2 months had passed since his encounter with the Guardians in the sacred glade, and life in Blackridge had settled into a new rhythm, one that honored both his usual routines and his newfound responsibilities. His leg had healed well, with only the occasional twinge when rain was coming. A weather predictor Martha assured him would become more accurate with time. "The forest speaks through our old injuries," she had told him with a knowing smile. The carving taking shape in his hands was a wolf, its features emerging with each careful cut of his knife. It would join the growing collection of guardian figures he had been creating, teaching tools for the future, though few in Blackridge yet understood their significance. A truck rumbled up his driveway, Pastor Samuel at the wheel. The elderly man climbed out slowly, carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Morning, Ethan," Samuel called, making his way to the porch. "Thought you might want to see this before Sunday's dedication." Ethan set aside his carving and welcomed the pastor with a handshake. Their relationship had subtly shifted since Ethan's accident, a new respect evident in Samuel's manner, though Ethan wasn't sure if the pastor fully understood why. Samuel unwrapped the package, revealing a small wooden box made from the red oak Ethan had harvested. The craftsmanship was exquisite, with intricate carvings decorating its surface. "This will sit on the new altar," Samuel explained, "for the communion elements. Tom Miller did the woodworking. He's got a gift." Ethan examined the box carefully, running his fingers over the patterns. To his surprise, he recognized several of the symbols, subtle versions of the markings he now knew were associated with the Guardians. Whether by intuition or ancestral memory, Tom had incorporated elements of the old knowledge into his design. "It's perfect," Ethan said, handing it back with newfound appreciation for how the forest's influence manifested in unexpected ways. "The wood found its purpose." Samuel nodded, rewrapping the box. "That's what I've always believed, you know. Everything in nature has its purpose in God's plan." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "Since your accident, you've changed, Ethan. There's a presence about you that reminds me of stories my grandfather used to tell." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "What kind of stories?" "About people who could read the forest like a book, who understood the mountains in ways others couldn't." Samuel gazed out at the tree-line. "He called them bridges, said they walked between our world and something deeper." The term sent a jolt through Ethan. Samuel's grandfather had been a keeper, the voice, according to Martha's explanation. Perhaps some of that knowledge had passed down after all. "Your grandfather sounds like a wise man," Ethan said carefully. "He was," Samuel agreed. "But times changed, and people wanted simpler messages from their pastor. Less talk of ancient pacts and forest spirits, more focus on scripture and salvation." He smiled sadly. "I followed the congregation's lead, but sometimes I wonder what was lost." It was an opening Ethan hadn't expected but recognized immediately. Perhaps not everything is lost, just waiting to be remembered. After Samuel departed, Ethan returned to his carving with renewed purpose. The pastor's unexpected awareness suggested that the old knowledge lay dormant rather than dead in Blackridge, seeds that might yet sprout with proper tending. In the weeks since accepting his role as bridge, Ethan had begun making subtle changes to his interactions with both the forest and the community. His logging business now operated with even greater selectivity and sustainability. He offered free consultations to landowners about forest management, subtly guiding them away from harmful practices and toward approaches that maintained balance. More significantly, he had begun sharing stories, carefully at first, presented as local folklore rather than literal truth. Once a month, he hosted evenings around his fire pit where neighbors gathered for food and conversation. There, beneath star-filled skies, he revived the tradition of the Carter family storytellers, sharing tales of the guardians of the ridge. Tonight would be the third such gathering, and Ethan had invited several new participants, including young Jake Dawson, who had helped rescue him, and Dr. Elena Reyes, the retired biologist whose work documenting local species changes had been revealed to Ethan in his visions. As evening approached, Ethan made final preparations, arranging logs around the fire pit, setting out the simple food and drinks, and most importantly, selecting the story he would share. Tonight's tale would be about the drought of 1838 and how his great-grandfather had been led to hidden springs by the Black Wolf, a story that balanced the mysterious with practical knowledge of local hydrology. The guests began arriving as sunset painted the western sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Among the first was Martha, who had become a regular at these gatherings, her presence lending subtle legitimacy to Ethan's stories among those who respected her practical knowledge of plants and healing. Jake Dawson arrived with his father Phil and two friends from the logging crew. They brought locally brewed beer and their characteristic good humor. Dr. Reyes came shortly after, her keen eyes taking in the gathering with scientific curiosity. Several other locals completed the circle, including Tom Miller, whose woodworking had so impressively incorporated Guardian symbols. When all were settled around the crackling fire, mugs of beer or cider in hand, conversations naturally quieted. This was the moment Ethan had been waiting for, the ancient human ritual of gathering around flame to share knowledge through story. Before we had books or schools, Ethan began, his deep voice carrying easily in the night air. We had stories. Ways of remembering what mattered, what kept us alive, what gave meaning to our lives here in these mountains. He told the drought story with careful detail, weaving in historically accurate information about the settlement patterns of Blackridge with the more mysterious elements involving the Guardian Wolf. As he spoke, he noticed Dr. Reyes leaning forward with particular interest when he described the location of the springs. When he finished, the silence that followed held a quality of thoughtfulness rather than skepticism. "That's near Cutter's Ridge, isn't it?" Dr. Reyes finally asked. "I've been studying the wetland ecosystem there. It's fed by underground springs that maintain flow even in dry years, crucial for local biodiversity." "Exactly there," Ethan confirmed, pleased by her connection between the story and ecological reality. "My grandfather knew those springs," Tom Miller added unexpectedly. "Said they were sacred places, not to be disturbed. I always thought it was just superstition, but..." He gestured to the forest. "There's wisdom in respecting what keeps the land healthy." The conversation flowed naturally from there. Stories of forest encounters, discussions of local conservation efforts, debates about development pressures facing the region. Throughout, Ethan listened as much as he spoke, identifying those whose minds and hearts seemed most open to deeper understanding. As the evening progressed, Jake Dawson pulled Ethan aside. "That wolf in your story," the young man said hesitantly. "I saw something like that last month while hunting up near the North Ridge. Too big for a normal wolf, and it seemed to be watching me." He shook his head. "Sounds crazy, I know." "Not crazy at all," Ethan assured him. "The forest has many extraordinary inhabitants if we pay attention." By the time the gathering dispersed, several seeds had been planted, connections made, curiosities awakened, old knowledge beginning to stir in new minds. It was exactly what the Guardians had shown him, the gradual, organic rebuilding of awareness within the community. Later that night, after his guests had departed, Ethan walked to the edge of his property where the cultivated land gave way to forest. The waxing moon provided enough light to see the familiar black shape waiting among the trees. "They're starting to remember," Ethan told the wolf as it emerged to stand beside him. "Slowly, but it's happening." The wolf pressed briefly against his side in what Ethan had come to recognize as approval. Together, they walked the boundary line between settlement and wilderness, the very space that Ethan, as bridge, was meant to help his community navigate with greater wisdom. No words were exchanged, but communication flowed between them nonetheless. Impressions, intentions, shared purpose. When they reached the eastern edge of Ethan's property, the wolf stopped, looking toward town, then back at Ethan. "Yes," Ethan agreed, understanding the unspoken message. "The next step is to bring some of them deeper, those who are ready." The wolf's amber eyes held his for a meaningful moment before it turned and melted back into the forest darkness. In the months and years that followed, Ethan Carter fulfilled his role as bridge with growing skill and purpose. His monthly storytelling gatherings expanded, eventually moving to the community center during winter months. What began as folklore nights evolved into a more comprehensive program of ecological and historical education, always with the ancient wisdom of the Guardians woven subtly throughout. Jake Dawson became his first apprentice, the young man's natural affinity for the forest making him receptive to deeper teachings. Dr. Reyes contributed scientific validation that helped skeptics appreciate the practical wisdom in the old ways. Even Pastor Samuel began incorporating subtle references to forest stewardship in his sermons, gradually reclaiming his family's role as voice. The Guardian's guidance manifested in countless ways, sometimes dramatic, as when the Black Wolf led a search party to lost hikers during a sudden blizzard, sometimes subtle, as when the Golden Eagle's appearance preceded and warned of a dangerous windstorm. With each instance, more townspeople began to notice the patterns, to sense the watchful presence that had always protected Blackridge. Ethan documented everything in the journal he had inherited, continuing the unbroken record that stretched back generations. He added his own observations, sketches, and insights, creating a resource for future keepers, whether from the Carter line or others who might be called to serve. On summer evenings, children of Blackridge now gathered eagerly around Ethan's fire pit, their young minds open to the stories of the Guardians of the Ridge. They learned to recognize the signs in nature, to move through the forest with respect, to understand their place in the ancient balance. Some showed particular sensitivity to the presence of the Guardians, and these children received special attention, potential future bridges being nurtured early. As for Ethan himself, the solitary lumberjack found unexpected fulfillment in his new role as community storyteller and teacher. The connection to the Guardians had healed something long broken within him, his sense of belonging, of purpose, of continuity with past and future. The forest was no longer merely his workplace, but his partner, and Blackridge no longer just his hometown, but his sacred trust. On the anniversary of his accident, Ethan returned alone to the stone circle under a full moon. There, surrounded by the assembled Guardians, he renewed his commitment to the ancient pact. The Black Wolf, his constant companion in this journey between worlds, stood beside him as he placed his palm once more upon the altar stone. This time, he did not come seeking answers, but offering gratitude. For in finding his place as bridge between human and wild, between past wisdom and future hope, Ethan Carter had discovered that some wounds can only be healed by accepting a calling greater than oneself. The Guardians of the Ridge continued their ancient vigil, but no longer alone. Their human counterparts were awakening once more, remembering their responsibility to the land that sustained them and the delicate balance that ensured mutual survival. It was not a return to the past, but a new integration, traditional wisdom guiding contemporary stewardship, ancient connections informing modern conservation. And at the center of this renewal stood a once ordinary lumberjack who had heard the forest calling and found the courage to answer, becoming, in his own unassuming way, exactly the bridge his community needed to find its way back to harmony with the living world that had always been its true home. Give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and if you've watched this far, comment, "I watched this far," and share your thoughts on this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video that appears on the end screen. It's super exciting.